For those completely in the dark about why Splash Mountain was just closed in Disney World, I've decided to go into an in-depth history of the movie that the ride was based upon, and the whole impetus for the story and all of that. I found this really comprehensive documentary on YouTube that just went into like all the details, everything that like I may have missed on first researching the topic, and I just decided I'm gonna just react to this and give my little commentary. But yeah, the guy goes in really deep, and I'm just gonna pull this up really quick. If you don't know, Splash Mountain has been uh, has been shut down due to people complaining about its being tied to this movie, Song of the South, which depicts a an idyllic setting. It takes place right after the Civil War is like 5 years. 1870 is the time it takes place. See, that's not explained in the movie. You're just kind of thrust into this setting, so people don't even realize, that these the black people in the movie are not supposed to be slaves. They're working on the plantation, but they're being paid to stay there. So, yeah, people watch this and they don't know the full context of what's going on. So they just assume, that the black people are in this subservient role like they were during slavery times. So a lot of assumptions are made, and you'll see in the documentary that assumptions were made when the movie came out. Like people did not even go to see it; they just assumed that this was a slavery time being depicted in the movie, and it wasn't. So yeah, even today, people have not seen it, and they make assumptions because Disney refuses to release this movie. They refuse to release an official DVD or Blu-ray of this movie or put it on Disney Plus. Other things they have put on Disney Plus and added, like little disclaimers, just like they did, just like Warner Brothers did with Gone with the Wind. They took it off HBO Max and then they put it back on with a disclaimer. See, Disney could do that with Song of the South, but they, for some reason, refused to. And Bob Iger has also gone on record stating that it's antiquated, it's, you know, pretty offensive. But I have to wonder too, has he seen the movie? I, I, I mean, other than some of the dialogue, maybe like could have been changed a little bit. Uh, it's not really. It's pretty harmless. It actually shows race relations in a positive light more than anything because you have this old black man befriending a young boy and telling him these life lessons through stories, which is one of the oldest forms of entertainment, one of the oldest forms of learning is through stories. So I wanted to pull this up and get into the nitty gritty because yeah, it's something. This documentary. Let's get into it. See. Really quick while I share the screen. Right quick, right quick. Yep. All right, let's go.
Song of the South needs no formal introduction. It's well known for being a Disney property that's been purposely hidden away, rendered unavailable for the general public to see. More people probably know about its problematic hindrance versus those that have probably seen the movie, being since the 90s where this film was classed to be unethical to show within the US. The subject of banning media that's not politically correct in our modern age is still a subject that remains relevant. At the time of this video being in production, it's currently the mist of 2020, where within the light of the upheaval protests over George Floyd's death, causing the debate of racial inequality, and relating back to the video, is that how do we perceive media that was made in another time, As many films and shows with dated
That's
depictions of minority
she's
groups
also in the
have
movie.
either had an attachment of a
Uh,
warning of the offending content or completely removed altogether in light
you'll
of the
see
situation.
Hattie McDaniel. That,
We shall
I have
discuss
no idea
further
what
the
that was.
2020 debacle and how exactly Song of the South came back in the recent discussion. But first I feel it's important to understand as to where exactly Song of the South came from. But first, before we begin, allow me to clarify that I'm not here to make you appreciate or dislike the topic, or use this video to win a debate. For example, if you hate Walt Disney, believing that he's an absolute evil tyrant, then
I
you're
don't know
probably not
why
going to
people would
appreciate
think
what
that.
I'm going to say about him. Or if you're somebody on the opposite end, absolutely adoring Walt Disney, believing that he can do no wrong, then
He
you
was
probably won't
a guy.
appreciate the
Okay,
direction this video
nobody
will
ever
go.
said he could do no wrong. He was a guy just trying to tell great stories and entertain people while also making money doing it. I mean, isn't that the purpose of business? But Disney seems to have lost that.
In. At the end of the day, me and this video
Entertainment,
are just merely a
actually.
connoisseur to open a window to another time. We can't change the past. We can only go forward
And bringing
and
these
learn from
stories
it,
to a
and
new
can
audience.
only hope to offer a new perspective.
Kids today probably never heard of this name or Uncle Remus or Brer Rabbit.
The tales of Brer Rabbit and Uncle Remus originated from the book stories by Joe Chandler Harris, born in 1848 as an illegitimate child, with his father shortly abandoning him and his mother. The naive young lad had an uphill battle, surrounded by his peers in private school, as he had a tendency to stutter and stammer that would have made him an easy target. Although he was a bright pupil doing immensely well at reading and writing, but flourished poorly as a student, eventually leading him to drop out. But just around the corner, the American Civil War had commenced, making it difficult for the young man to find any work. That was until, at the age of 14, Joseph Addison Turner hired him on board to help him write The Countryman, which was the only newspaper in the country to center around plantations. The boy came to live on Turner's plantation. During his time there, he befriended some of Turner's slaves, such as Uncle George Terrell and Auntie Chrissy, where they would tell the boy about their traditions and stories, sharing old folk tales and oral stories such as Brer Rabbit, with the titular character usually learning a moral, which the tales had originated from Africa, passed down by generations, but with each retelling had been slightly modified to fit in with the American location. Joe Chandler Harris felt that he could relate and connect with the former slaves, as they'd been heavily judged throughout their lives, just like himself, despite the fact that he had a much more privileged lifestyle compared to the slaves. In his adulthood, he would write down these stories that he heard on the plantation.
So yeah, he sees the plight of the black people and he relates to them because they've been like ostracized. They've been put down their whole lives. He feels the same way, even though he's privileged. Like people go through their own battles. Like it doesn't matter what your background is.
In the context of the book, they were a collection of tales that were told by Uncle Remus, an old, humble
So
man that was a
he obviously
former
based
slave.
him off
Chandler
the
Harris'
slave that he met.
retellings of these old tales were
But
the American equivalent of
Uncle Remus, though,
Winnie the
it's important to point out, is a former slave in the story.
Pooh in popularity. He also
Yeah, it was
posed
as
for race
popular as Winnie the Pooh.
relations and support of the African
I remember reading
Americans,
this as a kid.
which made him a progressive man for his time. His works would leave an impact for the reformation of the literacy field. He would pass away in 1908, although criticism has arisen of his work and legacy, such as his stories appropriating African American folk tales, and the country dialect that Chandler used for the black people in his stories. While historical records have pointed towards this perhaps being a real dialect of its time, with the upper class systems of those days,
Yeah,
people that didn't speak well-rounded
people act like
like the
people
royal
didn't talk like
family
this
were perceived
at
of
all.
not being very clever, with the tales of Uncle Remus being one of the very few characters within pop culture at that point to represent African American culture. The Chandler stories being widely popular would create an idyllic image of black people being happy and subservient within a hermit state, as those sort of people and others that didn't look of European descent were not seen or classed as real people within a white society, and the imagery and tropes that originated from the Uncle Remus stories would only help to reinforce this idea, even if Chandler had innocent intents, preserving this piece of American folktale. But through an immature and racist culture, the stories were used in a means of separation to justify that two groups of people were widely different from one another.
This doesn't mean
That I don't
superiority,
agree with.
but it does imply a version states that we are different, and we're always going to be different. Now, I don't want to marry into your family. I'm sure
I
you don't
didn't
want to
ask
marry into
you. I
mine.
didn't
You
ask you.
see?
I'm married. Well, you select the wife of your choice, and I select the wife of my choice. If my son and your daughter saw
Nick
each other and they
Stewart,
like each
I,
other,
I was
let them
just
mind
I
their
just
own
saw
Nick
business.
something on
Stewart.
YouTube about his wife trying to trying to it's the legacy of these people that had anything to do with the movie or the ride. They're all being erased. Like James Baskett, we'll get into that. He's the guy who played Uncle Remus in the movie.
Stuart, on that note, I'll see you in the movies.
38 years later, after Chandler's death, his stories would reach on a new level of the public's interest, in the form of Hollywood's most controversial movie to date. The 1940s was a depressing time for the Disney company, as the following feature films grew ever more
These are
expensive,
classics
but they
now,
didn't turn back
beloved,
much for a profit.
but they were
There was also a
money
hierarchy
pits.
developing at the studio, where those that were the main screenwriters and head animators would be paid in royalty, where those that were lower down in the working force would be placed in atrocious conditions to work in, and would receive very little salary. Walt Disney, in his mind, saw no initial problem. Spending years of blood, sweat, and tears into his own studio, he felt that he could run it as he wished. The company was his family, and he was the family man. But the breaking point came at Dumbo, where after the failing nature of his previous feature films, he was trying to cut costs and laying off a few of his workers.
I think the documentary mentions it, but James Baskett, who plays Uncle Remus in Song of the South, he plays one of the crows in Dumbo, so he already knew Disney. Well, they had never met, but he worked on the movie, and then they met for Song of the South, and Disney really became friends with him.
A whole lot of his animators went on strike. This went on for 5 weeks until finally Walt Disney signed the union agreement, allowing equal pay and working conditions for all the staff and crew. This experience traumatized Disney, not wanting to bring in outside influences. Dumbo would be marked as the final feature film that Walt had that family feel towards, and things would be in disrepair once his next feature film, Bambi, would have a lukewarm reception at the box office. Disney couldn't afford to have any more box office flops if he wanted his company to stay afloat. Walt's other feature film projects had to be placed on hold, as he had to think of his next upcoming feature film that wouldn't play as a financial risk to produce. A nostalgic story that he turned towards for inspiration was
So I guess, yeah, they wanted to steer away from animation a little bit because it was costing them so freaking much. So that's why they turned to live action, which actually benefited them a little. I mean, not a whole lot, but because animation was like their bread and butter, but it allowed them to tell like different stories, like they might not have thought about telling, like Treasure Island and uh, around. Shit, I think they did Around the World in 80 Days. I know they did 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And then, well, this was their first live action for a was Song of the South,
the old Uncle Remus
even though it still
stories,
had
a
animation.
relationship he maintained with the books since his young childhood, and for years desperately wanted to create his own film adaptation. Disney was able to acquire the film rights with the Harris family back in
Yeah,
1949.
this is another one of the with that Disney was just in love with, was the Uncle Remus stories.
Walt felt for the most practical and cost-effective way to bring these stories to life was to have the human characters such as Uncle Remus in live action, and the tales of Brer Rabbit would be illustrated through animation, combining both the live action and animation together, feeling confident that it could successfully be done. By judging the technology of their most recent anthology film at the time, The Three Caballeros, which combined both mediums together. By having the film with real actors and only having a third of it being animated, it would heavily reduce the cost of making it, which at the time his bankers weren't so confident for Walt to make another feature film within the medium of animation, since those films came with such a hefty price tag. Thus, the Uncle Remus story was going to be the first live-action narrative movie from the Disney company. but it was also going to be one of the first major Hollywood movies to heavily star an African American cast, and even having a main character that was African American. So when the film was first announced, there was a huge contentment towards how the plantation workers were going to be portrayed, as folks that weren't white in that era of film were usually not portrayed in the most friendliest of ways, and even those that were seen as the exception of the rule were still only side and secondary
Shirley
characters.
Temple.
During the time that the film was in production, the topic of plantation and slavery was still very much in living memory. Walt Disney was pressing on an adaptation with social issues, so he brought on the left-wing and old-fashioned Donald Raymond to pen the screenplay,
Yeah,
which for Donald was the first time that he ever endeavored in such
first
a
time he
task.
did
But
it.
upon early review of the
Sure.
Hays Office, a platform that regulated the offensibility of America's feature films, founded in 1934 and ran up until 1968, they found in the script to be a lot of offensive dialogue towards African Americans. Walt Disney had to appeal to the production code. It was a non-negotiable matter. Walt Disney hired Clarence Muse as a consultant on the film.
Okay, so this guy he wanted to play Uncle Remus, and then he'll get into it. Like some things happened with the script. He just left, and then he became embittered by it.
Clarence had initially started his career as a lawyer. Finding limited opportunities as a black man, he moved swiftly onwards to the entertainment field, becoming an actor, director, and writer. He was a commendable man for black rights. Clarence felt that this was a great opportunity for Disney to really transcend the stories, to make the perceptions of the blacks more respectable and commendable. That's if he can shy away from the most egregious stereotypes. But as a man that never appreciated the criticism of his work, Walt Disney wanted to treat his childhood simple tales as that. And Donald Raymond ignored what the consultant had to say. And only after a short while, Clarence left the project. As the film prevailed, Clarence censored nothing on his true thoughts of the project, only heightening the film's persona before its release. Through the ongoing news stories, the NAACP and the American Council for Race Relations and more desperately wanted to get involved and see the draft script. But Walt Disney politely rejected the offers.
I never test a film beyond the studio. No, we sort of design the films to appeal to ourselves, and we're our own censors. Within the studio group, if we do something that isn't right, we hear from the various members of the staff it just isn't right. You can't do that. So I test my films with my own people.
But through these ongoing pressures from separate parties, Walt Disney hired another consultant, an experienced screenwriter, Maurice Rapf. With his background coming from a Jewish family, Walt felt that he was an eligible man for writing sensitive material. But Maurice was mortified over the lines of dialogue using the word master and blackies, and told
Yeah, that's that original screenwriter that they were talking about. I guess he didn't realize that the stories were supposed to be, post Civil War era when the blacks were freed. So he was still referring to them as darkies and whatnot. Yeah, and even in 40 something, that wouldn't have flown.
Disney not to go through with the movie, but Walt asked if he could perhaps rewrite the screenplay, allowing him to make drastic changes towards the story, and also alter the animated segments, as up to that stage they had only just been merely storyboarded, thus they could be drastically reshaped. He took on the offer, but he kept clashing with the original screenwriter Donald Raymond. Maurice would eventually resign from the project as well, with Donald
Yeah,
restructuring his final
Donald
draft.
Raymond, I guess, was like really difficult to work with. This was his first attempt at writing something, and he just was not hearing any criticism. He wouldn't let anybody give him notes. Like, he just wasn't listening. I feel like Disney should have fired him, but I don't know.
With the lines of dialogue clarifying that Uncle Remus and the other plantation workers were not slaves would be eliminated in the final
Yeah, I don't know why
script.
they
Walt
eliminated
Disney would go on record clarifying that the African Americans seen in the film were not slaves, as many audience members were confused if they were slaves or not. The film never clarifies as to the exact position that the plantation workers are in. This aspect is probably
Yeah.
one of the greatest.
Yeah, you see the black people living, like, they're living, I guess, down by the river, to coin a phrase. And the white people, they still live in this mansion that's on a plantation. But you gotta remember, like, when the slaves were freed, they didn't have anything. Like, they were able to leave the plantations, but they, like, where were they gonna go? They didn't have any money or anything. So, like, they might just take on work around the plantations, but be paid this time. That's I see that how this could have this situation could have come about.
Split ends from the whole movie, as does it take place before or post-Civil War, when slavery was abolished. This is an aspect that's heavily argued upon between critics and the general public to this day.
This does take place in a time of slavery, and it's definitely
Yeah,
addressed, sort of.
I watched Nostalgia Critic's video on this, and I had to point out in the comments, this takes place in 1870 after slavery. But a lot of people apparently have this misconception.
And a super
There's a lot of
idyllic
videos
look at a master-slave
I
type
don't look-
relationship.
They seem like pretty jolly slaves, and they're even holding a candle
They're not
vigil
slaves.
for this kid.
He runs away from home, and his family owns slaves.
They're not
But it
slaves.
really looks like a plantation full of happy-go-lucky slaves who are more than pleased to do the bidding of their
Not
masters.
slaves.
Donald Raymond only took on board a fraction of the feedback for the final script, which earned his approval on the
Oh,
Hayes
you may
Office, allowing the film to go into
you may recognize the little girl. Shit. Yeah, yeah. There, yeah. You may recognize the little girl. She's in Fun and Fancy Free. Also one of my favorite Disney movies.
his approval on the Hayes Office, allowing the film to go into pre-production with a middling budget of $2 million, then commencing in
And the
principal
boy,
photography in
that's Bobby
1944,
Driscoll, who
being
later
filmed in
played
Hollywood
Peter Pan,
in Samuel
and he was in Treasure
Goldwyn
Island as
Studios.
Hawk.
Directing duties were given to Har Foster, with the animation being supervised by Wilford Jackson.
You look like Kennedy.
The role of Uncle Remus, the pinnacle of the heart and soul of the whole picture,
Yeah.
was played by James Baskett. Initially starting his career to study pharmacology, but lacking the finance to study, James turned towards a career of acting in Hollywood. He had actually previously worked for Disney in the 1941 film
Ooh.
Dumbo, doing the voice of one of the crows.
I've seen a dragonfly.
Many years later, when he was enrolling for Song of the South, he was intending just to do a bit part, voicing a butterfly. But when Walt Disney was listening to his voice, he wanted a chance to personally meet James Baskett one-on-one. When the two men met up, Walt Disney convinced James Baskett to audition for the role of Uncle Remus. And not too long after that audition, he got the gig. He played not only Uncle Remus, but also the butterfly and Brer Fox. Mr. Disney admired James Baskett. According to his sister, he said, "He is the best actor I believe to be discovered in
Yeah, his sister
years,
Ruth.
working wholly without direction." After production of the film had concluded, Walt Disney and James Baskett kept in close contact. But during this time, James Baskett's health was heavily decreasing. Disney sent gifts and ample amount of money to help him and his family get on by. But that wasn't enough. Disney wanted to ensure at the Oscars that his performance wouldn't be unnoticed. But through a loophole, at the time, the Academy wouldn't recognise an actor if they wouldn't get top billing. But he was probably not nominated for a much more unfair reason. James Baskett's co-star, Hattie McDaniel, at the time was the only other African-American to actually win an
I
Oscar.
just watched Gone with the Wind, and she is great in that. I highly recommend that movie. Like, sure, you got some, idyllic, antebellum kind of stereotypes, but it's really not that idyllic when you think about it, because a lot of horrible things happen to the main characters in this movie. The main characters who aren't black, they're white. Like, yeah, it's kind of a bleak movie when you think about it.
It was still extremely rare for anybody of color to even be nominated.
I wish somebody would help me right now, because I didn't expect, so I had a nothing in my mind.
But Disney was able to convince the Academy to give an honourable reward to James Baskett during the 20th Academy, historically making him the first African-American man to ever win that reward. Sadly though for James, it would be a short-lived victory, as he would pass away only 4 months later.
That's what's upset me about this whole situation. They're erasing his legacy by erasing the movie, the ride, everything.
Jamie was played by named at the time Bobby Driscoll, who was the first actor to be under a personal contract with the Disney company.
What made me mad just recently was that Chip and Dale movie where they have Peter Pan in there as a villain, and he's like, you can tell he's like a drug addict and he's living in poverty. It's like they were taking shots at Bobby Driscoll because he ended up that way, and he was the Peter Pan actor. It just really rubbed me the wrong way.
Starring in many early Disney live-action
They were
features,
making light of it.
and he would eventually go off and be the voice of Disney's Peter Pan. By this time, he had renamed himself Robert Driscoll as a way to distance himself from his younger image. By the 60s, he was struggling with a drug addiction. He relocated to New York to start a new life, but he would pass away in 1968. Ginny was played by Luana Patton, who started her career as a child model, with Song of the South being her first feature film, reuniting with Bobby in another Disney flick called So Dear to My Heart. She would go on acting as an adult, but never reaching the same popularity from her days at Disney, and would eventually retire in 1986. She would pass away a decade later at the age of 57. The young African-American that befriends Johnny, Little Toby, was played by Glenn Levy. He was discovered playing on the playground by a Disney talent scout, and out of the 3 main child actors, he was the oldest at the age of 7, and also was promoted the least when it came to the marketing of the movie. Him and his family relocated to Los Angeles in the hopes for him to pursue a career into acting. Although, unlike his co-stars, he didn't appear in any other feature films. Glenn Levy would be remarried several times and have many children, and would pass away at the age of 68. Real-life couples at the time, Ruth Warwick and Eric Rolfe, played Johnny's mother and father, but however they separated during the same year that the movie was released. Hattie McDaniel acted as Aunt Tempe, and as mentioned earlier, was the first African-American to win an Oscar in the 1939 epic Gone with the Wind. It too is usually compared to Song of the South for having the same racial inner problems. Hattie would usually find very little variation upon her acting career, usually playing a servant or a maiden. But as Hattie would go on to say, she would rather be paid $700 for playing a maiden in a big feature film rather than working as a real maiden for $7. For Hattie, there was just simply no other job that really paid like being in the movies. And Hattie knew that she had to be well integrated within the Hollywood system.
I was whining and crying all the time because I hated the way I had to act. Mammy said to me, "You will never come back to Hollywood again because you complain too much."
For the main character of the animated segments, Brer Rabbit was played by John Donson Lee Jr. Probably his best known work outside of Song of the South was his frequent appearance in the Amos and Andy Show, reigning from the 50s, and was also one of the earliest television programs to heavily feature black actors. The slow, dim-witted but charming Brer Bear was played by Nick Stewart. He was anti-Uncle Tom or any other black stereotype, and also heavily against the minstrel shows. Although his acting roles, he walked a very thin line from characters that could be classed as black stereotypes. Nick Stewart really loved the character of Brer Bear.
Walt Disney Song of the South. And in the center is Uncle Remus, James Baskett. And behind Uncle Remus, you see him people around? I did the voice of Brer Bear. I'm just not your head. Clean. Oh!
So you see,
in fact, he reprised the role as Brer Bear in the 1989 theme park ride inspired from the movie Splash Mountain. During the same year as the opening of the theme park ride, Jim Corcus, Disney historian and also fanboy, asked Nick Stewart towards how did he feel about being in the film, that did he find the role slightly demeaning.
And he just gave the biggest laugh I'd ever heard in my entire life. And he says, "Are you kidding? Disney treated us like kings." He took that money and in Los Angeles, he created the Ebony Theater Workshop in order to give black actors roles other than maids and butlers.
Nick Stewart spent his entire career keeping the Ebenezer Theatre open. Unfortunately, the building was demolished in 1998 beyond Nick Stewart's control, but in 2007 in Los Angeles, a theatre was reopened in its name, with a similar goal of appreciating African American culture. Sadly, Nick Stewart wouldn't be around to see it, as he passed away in the year 2000, living to the grand old age of 90.
See, this is the same thing we see with other companies like Aunt Jemima taking her completely off of the box, and her family complains about it. You know, it's because it's her legacy that they're destroying. Now Nick Stewart's legacy is disappearing as well. His daughter is pleading with Disney like not to close the park, but it's too late now. They closed it just today. They closed it.
Before its release, the title was revised, changing the name from Uncle Remus to Song of the South. Premiering on November 12th at Atlanta, Georgia, with the majority of the white cast were there, but the black cast were unable to attend because Georgian law would not permit them into the movie theatre. Mr. Disney left the premiere once the movie was screening, while he was happy during the interval presenting, but he feared that an unexpected audience reaction would upset him, so he retreated across the street to his hotel room for the night.
I heard
the film garnered a
there's something he doesn't mention, but I heard also that he heard about, like James Baskett not being able to attend the premiere and wanted to sit it out, in protest. But Baskett told him, no, you go ahead. Like, I don't know if that's true or not.
Critical response, with some that either loved it or sickly disliked it. Walter Francis White, the executive secretary for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, came onto the scene to write a statement on the feature. This is what he had to say, and I quote, "In an effort neither to offend audiences within the North or South, the production helps to perpetuate a dangerously glorified picture of slavery, making use of the beautiful Uncle Remus folklore. Song of the South unfortunately gives an impression of an idyllic master-slave relationship, which is a distortion from the facts, although it's worth noting that he actually never saw the movie, only getting a memo from 2 other members that saw the movie, which made him a bit perplexed at how to write a statement for the film. Eventually, the film would garner a backlash, with groups outside of the movie theatre protesting upon its playing, with some of the cast and crew, such as James Baskett, defending his role as Uncle Remus, with Walt Disney staying absent from the debate, being deeply upset as to why the film was gaining so much backlash. He felt that he placed his stories on a new platform for people to appreciate. But regardless on its reviews, it still did moderately alright at the box office, allowing Disney to finally proceed onwards with his other projects. Regardless of its backlash, Song of the South was treated on the same value as any other Disney property, as the cartoon characters appeared in commercials, along with the cartoon segments being shown in various formats upon television. In 1956, Walt Disney created a special hour-long program as a tribute to John Chandler Harris,
and gave the people outside the South their first knowledge of these beloved animal legends told on the plantations by the old Negro storytellers.
As a special way to promote the re-release of Song of the South.
He wants to try to keep these traditions alive, these stories alive, by retelling them, in another medium. That was Disney's main goal. And it just seems like current Disney is trying to erase the past instead of, presenting it as it was, and letting people make their own judgments about it.
Yeah, but the tribute to John Chandler Harris ceased re-airing during 1960, along with any re-releases of Song of the South during the duration of the 1960s. This may have been in light of the big political movement of that decade concerning the equal treatment between whites and blacks.
But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination.
After years and years of protest and backwards and forwards upon negotiations, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 finally put an end to the segregation for people of different skin colour, where black people would finally have the same opportunities as white folks. No longer being segregated, meaning they were no longer classed as second-class citizens. During Christmas of that year, Walt Disney released Mary Poppins, a film that was stuck within 20 years of negotiations, as Disney had to negotiate with Travers, who was the original book author of Mary Poppins.
Yeah, if you've watched Saving Mr. Banks, you know most of the story on this. They get some things wrong in the movie, like just for dramatic effect. Like he already had the rights to the movie when they were making it, and in Saving Mr. Banks, they make it to where like he hasn't got the rights yet. She hasn't signed them off. But yeah, she really did not like the movie when it came out, and she expressed that to him.
Upon how Disneyfied Travers wanted her story to be, Disney had to meet halfway with Travers upon certain aspects. But the film is largely Walt's own
The guy in
design.
the documentary, he makes it seem like Disney made all these compromises when it came to the story and whatnot. He really didn't. He just did what he wanted to.
As in the original contract for both parties, Walt would get the final say. Along with Song of the South, this was one of the very few times that Walt Disney in his career had to challenge his own vision. But Mary Poppins would be his final major production, as Walt Disney would pass away 2 years later.
Challenge his vision a little bit, just because he had never worked directly with the author on their own story when he made the movie before this.
Mary Poppins represent as to how much Walt was willing to sacrifice from his own branding and image that he built up for decades. That's exactly
what he wanted.
That he
She didn't want those
separate
animated penguins
from Song of the South, that he refused to make complicated. Now the Disney Corporation, without its fearless leader, and in this new segregated world, could they still harness and maintain that Disney image moving forward? And could such a film as Song of the South still be appreciated?
Here we come to one of Disney's failings nowadays.
The Disney Corporation had an exclusive tradition where every decade the films would be exclusively re-released back into theatres upon their anniversary of release. This was at the time the only way to re-watch a Disney animated feature, with the exception of several edited down for TV. Song of the South was exempt from being reissued back in the 1960s, and for a short period of time it had been considered to permanently
as much shit as I give Disney, I would still go see Alice in Wonderland if they played that in theaters right now, the original Alice in Wonderland.
But through popular demand, it had been decided to give Song of the South another go in 1972, marking it as 16 years since the film was last publicly available, with the conversation of the civil rights movement largely subsiding by this point, making the corporation feeling much more comfortable to unveil the feature. The film reissue was a success, making $7 million, making it the most successful Disney re-release up until that point. It had made more money than its last two releases, which together brought in about $5.4 million, and the critical response was far more positive than its original 1946 release. It appeared time was far more kinder to Song of the South. Despite the annual decade re-release, it was actually re-released the following year as a double feature alongside Aristocats, as part of the 50th anniversary of Walt Disney Productions, then being re-released in 1980 in time for the 100th anniversary of the original publications of the Uncle Remus Tales, with the reissues doing far more better in box office numbers, being far more successful than the surrounding Disney features of that era.
Okay, so Tron has become a cult classic by now. Black Cauldron, same thing. The Black Hole I've never even seen. But yeah, these were like flops when they came out.
And so desperately to break out of that Disney mold, proceeding into the 80s, where the new Disney films were dwindling in popularity and the company's priority, with Disney during this time becoming far more well known for its other assets, such as the Disneyland parks, where its most luxurious film of the past decade was getting its own theme park ride. To spice the water for the public's interest, and just in time for its 40th anniversary, for the fourth time in 13 years, Song of the South was reissued yet again. But the reviews of this time round, while the animated segments were still appraised, the live-action portions, on the other hand, were becoming very reminiscent of the critiques back from the 40s. It had been 22 years since of the civil rights movement, giving enough time for a generation of ethnic groups to create media productions that voice the concern of racial inequality, with projects such as the TV series Roots, painted a picture of what the Deep South was truly like. The seemingly stereotyped images in the film
by
could no
Alex
longer
Haley,
be
who
pardoned
also
by the general
wrote
public. The ride still
the autobiography of Malcolm X, which I have covered on this channel.
went on ahead for construction,
That's
and
really
while
good.
it was always intended for the ride to be mostly based on the animated portions, there were no references made of the live-action segments in the final ride. Splash Mountain was so popular it reappeared in several of the Disneyland theme parks. But little did anybody know at that point that the 1986 re-release of Song of the South would be marked as the final time the movie would ever be officially available in its own home native country.
I don't get why you want to close the ride anyway, because it has little to do with the movie. Like, you have the animated characters in there, but that's it. That's all. VHS comes out. Betamax.
In the late 80s and the duration of the 90s, Disney would release the majority of their back catalogue to home media, finally breaking their annual tradition of only showing their films specifically to the movie theaters, occurring by decade for special occasions, with the notable exception of Song of the South, at least being pardoned in the US, as it was sold on home media and even appeared on television in certain areas of the world, with the formats mainly consisting of VHS and Betamax, notably being released on Laserdisc in Hong Kong and Japan in 1990, with countries such as Italy and the Netherlands residing as the final places that the film was officially released on home media, that being VHS, in 1997. In 2006, the BBC broadcast Song of the South on UK television, thus marking it as the final time the film was officially shown anywhere. The following year, the CEO of Disney, Bob Iger, who had only been enrolled for the job for over a year, expressed an interest to release Song of the South. But in 2010, he said that there are no current plans to release the film, calling the film antiquated and fairly offensive. And usually the question is always popped up at every Disney shareholder meeting, usually responding, feeling that the timing isn't quite right.
Yeah, when is the timing going to be right?
Disney's creative director, Dave Bottix, in a 2010 interview, gave a spark of optimism for the Disney fans, recognizing the film's importance to the company's history.
Hey,
Not knowing when,
in the meantime, if you want a copy of this movie, they do have them online. Like, you might have to get a bootleg copy from another country, but they exist.
Guarantee that one day they will do something about Song of the South. In 1999, Disney fan Chris Willis launched a fan-made Song of the South website originally dedicated to his memorabilia, but it eventually grew into an information platform, mainly coming from the lack of information that was widely available about the movie, initially starting his website as a defender for the feature and a campaign to get the movie released, but gradually mellowing out over time. While still wanting to see the movie get its DVD release, he's revised a lot of his articles to be non-biased and more respectable towards different opinions, with a news article about any recent information
nobody
and
ever
having a
said,
whole page
yeah,
correcting
nobody ever said you're not entitled to your opinion. We're just saying, release the movie. Like, you can form an opinion if you want. Like, just release the movie.
Wikipedia rumors. His website is perhaps the most comprehensible source of information about Song of the South. Floyd Norman was the first Black Disney animator working at the studio during Walt Disney's lifetime, working on such classics such as Sleeping Beauty and The Jungle Book, then moving on to television and working on a number of Hanna-Barbera cartoons. He co-financed his company,
I wonder what he
films,
had to say about that Velma series. Holy shit.
Centering around African-American culture. He's had a long, meticulous career working on a number of animated projects, but despite being one of the earliest Black animators, Mr. Norman has never gave a second thought towards this significant fact.
Always been these horrible rumors around that he was not friendly, particularly to people of color, didn't like Black people, and you hold it up against the man you know. What do you want people to know?
Well, these rumors simply will not go away. But that was not the Walt Disney I knew.
I don't know.
In 2016, he was made a Disney legend. While he no longer works for the company, his title of a legend makes him a senior to be listened to. and has been a supporter of getting the film republicized once again. He's even revealed that book publishers have tried to use his influence to try and license off some of the rare animals from the Disney classic. In 2017, Whoopi Goldberg was made a Disney legend, and after the ceremony, she expressed an interest of trying to start a conversation to re-show Song of the South.
While I don't agree with a lot of the shit she says, I agree with her on this.
Suggesting that if it is indeed released on DVD, that it would be most appropriate to include some bonus features to educate the surrounding controversy about the movie.
Yes, help people understand.
For example, you could very easily have a documentary, the making of the film Song of the South, use entertainment to really educate and show a little bit of American history.
As it's been seen with companies releasing movies and TV shows from yesteryears with questionable depictions, usually accompanied by a featurette explaining the offending content. Even Disney themselves have practiced this. But as of yet, their internal talks are still in vain.
The Disney Corporation is going to find out very soon, if they do release this film, that African Americans will be outside protesting, that bringing back up that painful reminder, is a slap in the face to our ancestors.
Oh yeah, they sure got scared after that. The summer of love, quote unquote.
On the 25th of May of 2020,
They're
an
very
African-American by the name of George Floyd was arrested after suspicion of carrying a fake $20 note. But while he was being obtained, George broke down into a panic attack, pleading to the officers to not get into the police vehicle as he was claustrophobic. The situation got progressively worse, where George was pinned down, where Officer Derek Chauvin was pressing his knee on George's neck. George repeatedly said over 20 times to the officer that he couldn't breathe, until he finally passed out. An ambulance arrived on the scene, but by then it was far too late. George Floyd had died. Derek Chauvin was later arrested for second-degree murder, along with the other officers at the scene. This image of a black man dying at the hands of a white officer hit too close to home for many colored people. This started a movement that there was still a lack of equality in our society, re-sparking the embellishment of the Black Lives Matter movement, initially starting in the US, but it has now transcended across the globe. During this time, media companies have been retracting some of their content that may be seen as racially insensitive,
reactionary response to this.
They also have heavily re-evaluated their current productions that can feature coloured minorities. The Black Lives Matter movement has even caused an echo through the Disney parks, where after 34 years they've decided to retire the Splash Mountain ride and to retheme it as a Princess and the Frog attraction, another Disney film that portrays African Americans in a more positive light.
That's completely fantasy.
For the general public.
But then Song of the South.
Even references towards the film, such as the instrumentals of Zip-A-Dee-Doo-Dah, have been removed from the park, which in consequence has made Song of the South even more outside of the Disney circle. The future for the film is currently bleak. The definition of racism is by discriminating or hating against a group of people upon their skin color, culture, and nationality. Confuse individuals trying to seek out any aspect that could be interpreted as being racist, say that they don't see anything that's immediately problematic. As the plantation workers, and Uncle Remus especially, is seen in a well-being manner, teaching Johnny high moral messages, and are never seen explicitly hated against. But it's its antiquarian stereotyping that holds its damaging nature. While Song of the South did not invent the imagery of a white master and black servant relationship, and nor was it alone depicting this kind of relation. But in movies between blacks and whites for its time, using Song of the South as a prime example, we see the black individuals have their life completely evolve around the white family.
Yeah, I think Hollywood up to this point had seen way too much of that. And so they, they see the stereotypes, even though that's not what Disney was going for. Like, I guess he was going for like a harmonious kind of life between whites and blacks, like they get along, you know.
A young youth of African American could watch the film and wonder why the white family are privileged to have so much luxury around them compared to the black people, where the place that they reside to and the clothes they wear are in disrepair. For decades, this type of imagery in media has for multiple generations made non-whites feel as if they don't want to be seen.
Alex, your son, gonna feel when he looks up and there's a Caucasian boy up there. And I was like, I don't know. That's how, don't people want to see that? I mean, I don't know if anyone wants to see a Filipino American.
This
Granted,
this kind of
maybe not every
mentality,
single
I feel is like very detrimental. Like I feel like a lot of people just automatically hate themselves. I don't know where this comes from, but I feel like we still want to see different looking people on the screen. Like I identify with the Ninja Turtles and they look nothing like me. E.T. look nothing like me. Like I bring this up over and over again. Martian Manhunter, a green person who can change shapes. Like like you identify with them because they're human. Like they have human characteristics, not because of their skin color.
individual, but the impact
But
for a
Hollywood
lack of
seems to
equal
forgot that.
opportunity seen in movies and shows can't be ignored.
Yeah, because I grew up wanting to have blue eyes and blonde hair,
Yeah,
and
that's
I wanted my name to be
that's a
Mary.
you
You know,
problem.
because again, we were so subjected to those images and those images alone.
I changed my name a few times too. I remember putting
That's an
clothespins
inner
on my
kind of
nose to make my nose narrower because I
psychoses.
was ashamed of what I looked like. It didn't fit in and it didn't belong on camera.
And while the industry have taken great steps to break the mold of diversity,
He
it
was
still
my
has been a
look, he was
controversial
my favorite
ideal.
freaking character in that trilogy up until they sidelined him. Uh, he was the one I was most intrigued by. I'm like, oh, a stormtrooper who defects? That's awesome. And then they did nothing with his character in the other two movies. I was pretty let down. Ray, like, I couldn't really give a fuck about. I was I was more interested in
Steps
his
to break the
story.
mold of diversity, it still has been a controversial ideal.
I know for Susie, one of the most important things was that she sounds smart and that she's very well spoken because there were not a lot of brown girls in cartoons. As a matter of fact, there still aren't. I love when people of color come up to me and say, you don't know what it meant to me to see myself in a cartoon. I got one little black girl that I get to see that looks like me. Thank you so much.
In an idealized world, it'd be great to think that since the early days of cinema, that society has taken great strides of everybody having an equal opportunity. But the sad truth is that there's still so many out there that feel treated unfairly in the world.
Cutting out one blackface joke in an episode and the episode remains intact, you can walk away from. You can't walk away from a death from a bullet.
It's easy to say that these people
know
are
what one has
oversensitive,
to do with the
but
other,
it is important to recognize that people are entitled to how they personally feel.
Yes,
and
people
shrugging
are
off
entitled to their feelings. No one ever said you weren't. However, people shouldn't have to capitulate to your feelings just because your feelings are there. You know, like your feelings are valid, but we don't have to listen to you like all the time. 'Cause, see, I have feelings about Big Bang Theory. I think it's very detrimental to like nerd culture. I think it's very stereotypical. You know, and the characters don't feel like real characters. They just feel like stereotypes. I actually really hate that show and everything it's done to mainstream nerd culture. But I don't call for it to be boycotted, banned. I don't, you know, I don't do like these dumb fucks that are buying up J.K. Rowling's books and taking off the title. Taking off her name, you know, and reselling them. I don't do shit like that to things that I object to. I just move on with my life if I object to it. Like, I don't get this activist mentality that people have, like over things that just really do not affect them that much.
of the situation doesn't precisely help the people in question.
And I was like, okay, I'm gonna do this.
And you can say, okay, I can see the arguments already coming. Like, you can say it doesn't affect me because I'm a white cis man, whatever. But like, it wouldn't affect you if you didn't let it get to you so much. Like, if you didn't like internalize it so much. Like, things just are, Like, this movie just is, like, it's not gonna hurt anybody. Like, I can shit on that Velma show as much as I want and still be cool with it
Did Walt Disney
existing.
intentionally created a racist movie? Not likely. He so highly rated his black
It's not gonna
workers
destroy,
on the same level as
the
his white
original
workers.
Scooby-Doo.
Despite the rather loose attempt to meeting the consultants halfway, was he neglectful on the historical facts of the movie? Likely, but he was also neglectful on the German setting of Snow White.
Yeah.
Very little of Italian
Yeah,
culture
nothing's
is
really
shown through
accurate.
Pinocchio.
Like, look at Hunchback of Notre Dame. That was after Walt Disney's time, but still, like, completely different from the movie, but still great.
The genesis of where these stories came from
Mary
garnered little
Poppins,
interest
others.
from Walt Disney, just as these fairy tales have been changed and manipulated for over generations. Walt Disney saw fit to do the same. While he didn't write the script, he could have ceased the arguments that were constantly being fired up by Donald Raymond. But regardless of the facts, is it justifiable for Song of the South to be locked up? Well, that's up for the individual.
Yep, that's up for you to decide. I think it shouldn't be locked up. But yeah, that's it for now. Well, it's too late to stop Disney from closing Splash Mountain. But hey, we got Princess and the Frog ride supposed to be there. That'd be cool. That movie didn't do great at the box office, but it's pretty beloved. Like, I really like it. Like, I watched when it was on TV. Like, I would watch it over and over again. It was like on Encore or something, because it's a lot of fun. So maybe this new park will do well. We'll see. I still think they should have done 2 separate parks, but that's just me. I feel like Disney just cheapened out on this one, and used the quote unquote racism as an excuse. But tell me what you think in the comments below. You can see everyone's opinion is valid. That's all I'm saying. Like, you can love it or hate it. Your opinion is valid. You can be lukewarm on it. Your opinion is also valid. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.